The words hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither was ready to cross, yet somehow Kyle Mitchell found himself standing on the other side, staring at Robert Davis with an expression that made Robert's chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Kyle had just said, "I didn't mean to bother you," and Robert had responded with the kind of brutal honesty that surprised even himself. "You never could." The hurt that flickered across Kyle's face was immediate and devastating, a crack in his usual confident facade that made Robert realize he had misunderstood everything about this moment, about the past 3 months, about the careful dance they had been performing around each other. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, standing in Robert's cramped apartment kitchen at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, with Kyle's jacket still dripping from the October rain and Robert's heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to when Robert Davis thought he knew exactly who he was and what he wanted, before Kyle Mitchell walked into his life and turned everything sideways. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. 3 months earlier, Robert had been living the kind of life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow from within. He worked at a prestigious marketing firm downtown, occupying a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling city streets. Yet he often found himself staring out at the world below, feeling disconnected from it all. He had a decent apartment in a trendy neighborhood filled with carefully curated furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine, but never quite felt like home. Most importantly, he was dating Christine Mendoza, a beautiful woman who checked all the boxes his family and friends expected him to check. Christine was smart, successful, and genuinely kind, with an infectious laugh and a way of making everyone around her feel welcome and appreciated. But something fundamental was missing from their relationship. Something Robert couldn't name but felt in the spaces between their conversations. In the way their kisses felt more like performance than passion, in the careful politeness that had settled over their interactions like dust on furniture. It was Christine who first mentioned Kyle, actually. She had met him at a gallery opening in the Arts District, where he was showcasing his photography as part of a group exhibition featuring emerging local artists. She came home that night with the kind of animated energy she usually reserved for discovering a new restaurant or finding the perfect pair of shoes, her eyes bright with excitement as she told Robert about this incredible photographer she had met. She described how his work captured something raw and honest about human connection, how he had this way of seeing people that made them feel truly seen rather than simply observed. His photographs weren't just technically excellent, she explained. They were emotionally resonant in a way that had left her standing in front of his pieces for nearly an hour, studying the faces of strangers and feeling like she understood something profound about their inner lives. She insisted they invite him to their next dinner party, certain that Robert would appreciate Kyle's artistic sensibility and intellectual curiosity. Robert's first impression of Kyle was that he was exactly the kind of person Christine would be drawn to, charismatic and artistic, with an easy smile and the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were. He was tall and lean with dark hair that always looked slightly disheveled, as if he had just run his fingers through it, and green eyes that seemed to notice everything while revealing very little about what was going on behind them. During that first dinner party, Robert found himself watching Kyle more than participating in conversations, fascinated by the way he listened to people, really listened, leaning forward slightly and asking follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely interested in their answers, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Kyle had a gift for making people feel heard, for drawing out stories and opinions that others might have kept to themselves. Kyle had a way of making everyone in the room feel like they were the most interesting person there. But when his attention turned to Robert, it felt different somehow. More intense, more focused. Like Kyle was looking past the polite social mask Robert wore to something deeper underneath. When Kyle asked about Robert's work, about his thoughts on the city's new development projects, about his opinion on the wine they were drinking, Robert felt like Kyle was genuinely curious about his perspective, not just making conversation. It was unsettling and thrilling at the same time, to be seen so clearly by someone who was essentially a stranger. After that first meeting, Kyle became a regular fixture in their social circle. He would join them for drinks after work, appearing at their usual bar with his camera bag slung over his shoulder and stories about whatever project he was working on. He showed up at weekend barbecues with bottles of wine that were always perfectly chosen for the occasion, and somehow always ended up in the kinds of deep conversations that lasted until 2 in the morning. The kind where people revealed things about themselves they hadn't planned to share. Robert told himself he enjoyed Kyle's friendship because Kyle was interesting, because he brought out a side of people that was usually hidden, because he made their group dynamic more engaging and intellectually stimulating. He didn't examine too closely why he found himself looking forward to Kyle's texts, why he felt a small thrill when Kyle specifically asked for his opinion on something, why he started paying more attention to what he wore when he knew Kyle would be around. The shift began slowly, so gradually that Robert didn't notice it at first. Kyle started showing up to things alone more often, mentioning casually that he had broken up with someone he had been casually seeing, a fellow photographer whose work Kyle described as technically proficient but emotionally vacant. Christine, ever the matchmaker and always eager to help her friends find happiness, kept trying to set him up with her friends from work and graduate school, introducing him to smart, attractive women who seemed perfect for someone with Kyle's interests and sensibilities. But Kyle would politely decline these setups, saying he was focusing on his work, that he wasn't really looking for anything serious right now, that he preferred to let relationships develop naturally rather than through formal introductions. Robert found himself relieved by these rejections, though he couldn't articulate why. The thought of Kyle dating someone else made his stomach twist with something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. It was during one of their group's regular Thursday night gatherings at their usual bar that Robert first noticed Kyle watching him. Really watching him. Robert had been telling a story about a disastrous client meeting where everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, gesturing with his beer bottle, and probably being more animated than the story warranted when he glanced over and caught Kyle's gaze. Kyle wasn't laughing along with the others or checking his phone or scanning the room like people do when they're only half listening. He was completely focused on Robert, his green eyes intent and something unreadable in his expression, something that made Robert's skin prickle with awareness. When their eyes met, Kyle didn't look away immediately like people usually do when caught staring. Instead, he held Robert's gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable, long enough for Robert to feel heat rise in his chest, before finally turning back to the conversation with a small smile that seemed to hold secrets Robert couldn't decode. That night, Robert lay awake next to Christine, who was sleeping peacefully beside him, her breathing deep and even, and tried to make sense of what he had felt in that moment. The intensity of Kyle's attention had been flattering, sure, but it was more than that. It had felt charged, electric in a way that made Robert's skin prickle with awareness, like there was some kind of current running between them that Robert had never experienced before. He told himself he was reading too much into it, that Kyle was just an attentive person who listened carefully when people spoke, that the weird energy he had felt was all in his imagination, a product of too much beer and not enough sleep. But then it happened again and again. Kyle would catch his eye across a crowded room and hold his gaze just a second too long, long enough for Robert to feel his heart rate pick up and his palms grow damp. Kyle would brush against him when reaching for something, his hand lingering on Robert's shoulder or arm in a way that felt deliberate, intentional. Kyle would laugh at Robert's jokes with genuine delight, even the ones that weren't particularly funny, as if Robert's sense of humor was something precious and rare. Kyle would remember small details about things Robert had mentioned in passing, bringing up a book Robert had said he wanted to read, or asking about a work project Robert had briefly complained about, demonstrating a level of attention that made Robert feel seen in a way he wasn't used to. The attention was intoxicating, and Robert found himself craving more of it. He started telling better stories when Kyle was around, being more charming, more animated, more like the version of himself he thought Kyle might find interesting. He began to notice things about Kyle, too. The way Kyle's eyes crinkled when he laughed, the way he absently played with his camera strap when he was thinking, the way his voice got softer when he was being sincere about something that mattered to him. Robert memorized these details without meaning to, storing them away like precious things, treasures he could take out and examine when he was alone. Christine noticed the change in their dynamic before Robert did, She mentioned it casually one evening while they were getting ready for bed, saying something about how nice it was that Robert and Kyle had become such good friends. How Kyle seemed to really get Robert's sense of humor in a way that brought out Robert's more playful side. There was something in her tone that made Robert look at her more carefully, a note of curiosity or perhaps concern that he couldn't quite identify. When he asked what she meant, she just shrugged and said it was nothing, just an observation. But Robert caught something in her expression that suggested she was thinking more than she was saying. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday in September. Their usual group had planned to meet at the bar, but one by one people started canceling. Christine had to work late on a presentation that was due the next morning. Gloria White had a family emergency involving her elderly mother. And Jack Patel was coming down with a cold that had left him feeling miserable and contagious. By 7 o'clock, it was just Robert and Kyle sitting across from each other in their usual booth, surrounded by empty chairs that suddenly felt significant, like the absence of their friends had created a space for something new to emerge between them. Without the buffer of other people, their conversation took on a different quality. More personal, more intimate, like they were finally free to explore the connection that had been building between them for months. Kyle asked about Robert's photography hobby, something Robert had mentioned months ago, and then never brought up again, embarrassed by what felt like a juvenile interest. Robert found himself talking about why he had stopped taking pictures, how he used to love capturing moments, but somewhere along the way had lost the passion for it, had started to feel like his photographs were technically competent but emotionally empty. Kyle listened with the kind of attention that made Robert feel like his words mattered, asking thoughtful questions about Robert's favorite subjects and techniques, sharing his own struggles with creative blocks and the pressure to constantly produce work that felt meaningful. They talked about their families, their fears, their dreams that felt too big or too embarrassing to say out loud. Kyle told Robert about growing up feeling different, about always feeling like he was performing a version of himself that other people expected to see, like there was some essential part of him that had to be kept hidden from the world. Robert found himself nodding along, recognizing something in Kyle's words that resonated with his own experience, though he couldn't quite name what it was. There was something about Kyle's honesty, his willingness to be vulnerable, that made Robert want to be equally open, to share parts of himself he usually kept carefully guarded. The conversation flowed so easily that Robert didn't notice how late it was getting until Kyle glanced at his watch and said they should probably head home. They walked to the subway together, their shoulders occasionally bumping as they navigated the crowded sidewalk, each contact sending small shocks of electricity through Robert's system. When they reached the point where they would go in different directions, Kyle turned to face Robert, and there was something different in his expression, something vulnerable and uncertain that Robert had never seen before. Kyle said, "I really enjoyed tonight. Just us, I mean. We should do this more often." Robert felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that he hadn't even realized was there. He said, "Yeah, I'd like that too." They stood there for a moment, the space between them feeling charged with possibility, before Kyle stepped back and said goodnight. Robert watched him disappear down the subway stairs, feeling like something important had just happened, though he wasn't sure what. The next few weeks passed in a blur of stolen moments and careful navigation. Robert and Kyle began texting more frequently, sharing articles and photos and random thoughts throughout the day, creating a constant stream of communication that felt both casual and intimate. They started meeting for coffee before work sometimes, sitting in the window of a small cafe near Robert's office and talking about everything and nothing while the city woke up around them. Kyle would show Robert photos he was working on, asking for his opinion on composition and lighting, and Robert felt honored to be trusted with Kyle's creative process, to be asked for input on work that clearly meant so much to Kyle. Christine seemed to sense the shift in Robert's attention, though she didn't say anything directly. She became more affectionate, more present, reaching for his hand more often and suggesting romantic dinners and weekend getaways, as if she was trying to reclaim something that was slipping away. Robert felt guilty about the distance he was creating, about the way his thoughts kept drifting to Kyle even when he was supposed to be focused on Christine, but he couldn't seem to stop himself from gravitating toward Kyle. Every interaction with Kyle felt more real, more vital than anything else in his life, like he was finally awake after years of sleepwalking through his days. It was during one of their coffee meetings that Kyle first brought up the subject of relationships in a way that felt pointed. He was stirring sugar into his latte, not quite meeting Robert's eyes when he said, "Can I ask you something personal?" Robert's heart rate picked up, but he tried to keep his voice casual. "Sure." Kyle was quiet for a moment, still stirring his coffee even though the sugar had long since dissolved, the spoon making soft clinking sounds against the ceramic mug. Then he said, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Like you're following a script that someone else wrote for you?" The question hit Robert like a physical blow, so accurate it took his breath away. He stared at Kyle, who was finally looking at him with those intense green eyes, and felt like Kyle could see straight through him to all the doubts and questions he had been trying to ignore for years. Robert said, "What do you mean?" Kyle leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper. "I mean, do you ever wake up and think, this is what I'm supposed to want, but it doesn't feel right? Like you're playing a part in a play you never auditioned for, saying lines that don't feel like they belong in your mouth?" Robert's mouth went dry. He thought about Christine, about their comfortable routine, about the engagement ring he had been considering buying, about the life everyone expected him to build. He thought about how none of it felt as real as this moment, sitting across from Kyle in a crowded cafe, feeling more seen and understood than he had in years. He said, "Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes I do." Kyle nodded slowly and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared understanding that felt dangerous and thrilling. Kyle said, "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about what it means to be honest with yourself, even when the truth is scary, even when it might change everything you thought you knew about who you are." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Robert wanted to ask Kyle what truth he was referring to, wanted to push deeper into this conversation that felt like it was leading somewhere important, but he was also terrified of what Kyle might say, of what it might mean for everything Robert thought he knew about himself. Instead, he glanced at his watch and said he needed to get to work. Kyle and Bobby all nodded and gathered his things, but as they were walking out of the cafe, he caught Robert's arm gently. Kyle said, "Robert, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? I mean that. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're feeling, I'm here." Robert felt something crack open in his chest, a longing so intense it was almost painful. He wanted to tell Kyle everything about the doubts and the confusion and the way Kyle's attention made him feel more alive than he had in years. Instead, he just nodded and said, "Yeah, I know, thanks." But that conversation changed something between them. There was a new undercurrent to their interactions, a sense of possibility that neither of them was quite ready to name. Robert found himself thinking about Kyle constantly, analyzing every text message and shared glance for hidden meaning. He started noticing things about men that he had never paid attention to before. The way a stranger's smile could be attractive, the way his coworker Jason Cook's laugh made him feel warm, the way certain actors in movies drew his attention in ways he had never acknowledged. The realization crept up on him slowly, then hit him all at once during a particularly boring work meeting. He was supposed to be paying attention to quarterly projections and market analysis, but instead he was thinking about Kyle's hands, about the way Kyle's fingers moved when he was adjusting his camera settings, about how those hands might feel against his skin. The thought was so vivid, so unexpected, that Robert felt heat flood his face. He excused himself to the bathroom where he stared at his reflection in the mirror and tried to process what was happening to him. He was attracted to Kyle, not just as a friend, not just intellectually or emotionally, but physically, viscerally attracted in a way that made his whole body feel electric. The admission was terrifying and liberating at the same time, like finally naming something that had been lurking in the shadows of his consciousness for months. Robert spent the next week in a state of barely controlled panic. He found himself avoiding Kyle's texts, making excuses when Kyle suggested meeting for coffee, throwing himself into work and his relationship with Christine with desperate intensity. If he could just focus on his normal life, he reasoned, these confusing feelings would fade. He could go back to being the person he had always been, the person everyone expected him to be. But avoiding Kyle only made Robert think about him more. Every unanswered text felt like a small betrayal. Every declined invitation felt like he was pushing away something precious and irreplaceable. Christine noticed his distraction and asked if everything was okay, her voice gentle but concerned. Robert assured her it was just work stress, a big project that was taking up all his mental energy, but he could see the doubt in her eyes, the way she was starting to watch him more carefully. It was Christine who finally forced the issue, though she didn't know it at the time. She had been planning a small dinner party for her birthday, something intimate with just their closest friends, and she specifically asked Robert to make sure Kyle was invited. She said Kyle had become such an important part of their group, and it wouldn't feel right to celebrate without him there. The way she said it, with such genuine affection for Kyle, made Robert feel even worse about the distance he was creating. Robert knew he couldn't avoid Kyle forever without raising suspicions, so he sent the invitation, trying to keep the message casual and friendly. Kyle responded immediately, saying he wouldn't miss it, and adding that he had been worried about Robert since they hadn't talked much lately. The concern in Kyle's message made Robert's chest tighten with guilt and longing. The night of the party, Robert was a wreck. He changed clothes 3 times, settling finally on a navy button-down that Christine had once said brought out his eyes, then changing again because he realized he was trying to look good for Kyle. He spent too long styling his hair, checking his appearance in the mirror like he was preparing for a first date, and nearly called in sick twice, inventing elaborate excuses that would allow him to avoid the evening entirely. When Kyle arrived, looking effortlessly handsome in a dark button-down shirt that brought out his eyes, carrying a bottle of wine and a small wrapped gift for Christine, Robert felt his carefully constructed composure crumble. Kyle made his way through the crowd of guests, greeting everyone warmly, but Robert could feel Kyle's attention on him, even when they weren't directly interacting. Every time Robert glanced up, Kyle seemed to be watching him with that same intense focus that had started all of this confusion months ago. About halfway through the evening, Kyle cornered Robert in the kitchen while Robert was refilling drinks. The kitchen was small, barely big enough for 2 people, and Kyle's presence seemed to fill the entire space, making Robert hyper-aware of every breath, every movement. Kyle said, "You've been avoiding me." It wasn't a question, and Robert didn't try to deny it. He kept his eyes focused on the wine bottle in his hands, afraid that if he looked at Kyle directly, everything he was feeling would be written across his face. Robert said, "I've been busy." Kyle stepped closer, close enough that Robert could smell his cologne, something warm and woody that made Robert's head spin. Kyle said, "Busy or scared?" The question hung between them, and Robert felt like Kyle was asking about so much more than just their friendship. He finally looked up, meeting Kyle's gaze, and saw understanding there and patience, and something that might have been hope. Before Robert could respond, Christine walked into the kitchen, breaking the moment. She smiled at both of them and asked if they needed help with anything. Robert mumbled something about having everything under control, and Kyle stepped back, the spell broken. But the damage was done. For the rest of the evening, Robert was acutely aware of Kyle's presence, of every glance and casual touch and shared smile. When Kyle helped clear dishes, their hands brushed as they reached for the same plate, and Robert felt electricity shoot up his arm. When Kyle laughed at something Christine said, Robert found himself watching Kyle's mouth, wondering what it would feel like to kiss him. The party ended around midnight, with guests gradually filtering out into the night. Kyle was among the last to leave, lingering in the doorway as he said goodbye to Christine, thanking her for including him and complimenting her on the meal. When he turned to Robert, there was something significant in his expression, a weight that made Robert's heart race. Kyle said, "We should talk soon. Really talk." Robert nodded, not trusting his voice, and watched Kyle disappear into the night. He helped Christine clean up in relative silence, his mind spinning with everything that had happened, everything that had almost happened. Later, lying in bed next to Christine, Robert stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what he was going to do. He couldn't keep avoiding Kyle, couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed between them. But he also couldn't imagine how to move forward, how to acknowledge what was happening without destroying everything he had built. The conversation Kyle had requested came sooner than Robert expected. 3 days after the party, Kyle showed up at Robert's office building at lunchtime, waiting in the lobby with 2 cups of coffee and a determined expression. Robert saw him through the elevator doors and felt his stomach drop with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Kyle handed him one of the coffees and said, "Let's walk." They found themselves in a small park a few blocks from Robert's office, sitting on a bench under a tree that was just beginning to turn autumn colors. The October air was crisp, and Robert wrapped his hands around his coffee cup for warmth, though he suspected the trembling in his fingers had more to do with nerves than cold. Kyle was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the park where office workers were eating lunch and mothers were pushing strollers. Then he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without running away this time." Robert's heart hammered against his ribs, but he nodded. Kyle turned to face him, and Robert was struck by how vulnerable Kyle looked, how different from his usual confident self. Kyle said, "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hit Robert like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He stared at Kyle, searching for any sign that this was a joke, but Kyle's expression was completely serious, completely open. Kyle continued, "I know this complicates everything. I know you're with Christine, and I know this probably isn't what you want to hear, but I can't keep pretending that what I feel for you is just friendship. It's more than that, and I think you know it." Robert's mind reeled. Part of him wanted to deny it, to protect the safe life he had built, but a larger part of him felt something like relief flooding through his system. Kyle had said it out loud, had named the thing that had been growing between them for months. Robert said, "Kyle, But Kyle held up a hand, stopping him. Kyle said, "You don't have to say anything right now. I just needed you to know. I needed to be honest, because living with this secret was killing me." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Kyle's confession settling between them. Robert thought about all the moments that had led to this, all the signs he had been too scared to acknowledge. He thought about the way Kyle's attention made him feel more alive than anything else in his life. Finally, Robert said, "I don't know what to do with this." Kyle nodded as if he had expected that response. He said, "You don't have to do anything. I just needed you to know where I stand." But Robert could see the hurt in Kyle's eyes, the fear that he had just destroyed their friendship for nothing. Robert wanted to reach out, to touch Kyle's hand, to offer some kind of comfort, but he was paralyzed by the magnitude of what Kyle had just revealed. They finished their coffee in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts. When it was time for Robert to go back to work, Kyle walked with him to the building entrance. As they were saying goodbye, Kyle said, "For what it's worth, I think you are worth the risk." Robert watched Kyle walk away, feeling like his entire world had shifted on its axis. He went back to his office and tried to work, but he couldn't concentrate on anything except Kyle's words, the sincerity in his voice, the way he had looked when he said he was falling in love. That evening, Robert was distracted and distant with Christine. She asked him several times if everything was okay, and he gave her vague answers about work stress and project deadlines. But he could see her growing concern, could feel the distance he was creating between them. Over the next few days, Robert found himself replaying Kyle's confession obsessively. He analyzed every word, every inflection, trying to understand what it meant for his life. He thought about Christine, about their relationship, about the future they had been building together. It was a good relationship, stable and comfortable, but was it enough? Had it ever been enough? He also found himself thinking about Kyle's question from weeks ago, about living someone else's life. Robert realized that was exactly what he had been doing, following a script that society and his family had written for him without ever asking if it was what he actually wanted. The crisis came to a head the following weekend. Christine had planned a romantic dinner for just the two of them, complete with candles and wine and her grandmother's recipe for osobuco. She had clearly put a lot of effort into the evening, setting the table with her good china and playing soft jazz in the background. And Robert tried to be present, tried to appreciate the gesture, but he felt like he was watching the scene from outside his own body. Halfway through dinner, Christine reached across the table and took his hand. She said, "Robert, I love you, and I can see that something is bothering you. Whatever it is, we can work through it together." The kindness in her voice, the genuine concern, made Robert feel like the worst person in the world. Christine deserved so much better than someone who was sitting across from her while thinking about another person. She deserved someone who could love her completely, without reservation, without constantly wondering what else was out there. Robert looked at her beautiful face, at her hopeful expression, and realized he couldn't keep living this lie. Not for her sake and not for his own. He said, "Christine, I need to tell you something, and it's going to hurt." Her face changed immediately, hope replaced by wariness. She pulled her hand back and said, "What is it?" Robert took a deep breath and said, "I think I'm gay." The words hung in the air between them, and Robert watched as Christine processed what he had just said. Her face went through several expressions: confusion, hurt, understanding, and finally a kind of sad resignation. She said, "Is it Kyle?" The question surprised him with its directness, but he realized he shouldn't have been surprised. Christine was perceptive, and she had been watching their dynamic for months. Robert nodded, unable to speak. Christine was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her plate. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. She said, I didn't want to believe it, but I could see how you looked at him, how you lit up when he was around in a way you never did with me." Robert felt his own eyes fill with tears. He said, "Christine, I'm so sorry. You don't deserve this. You deserve someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved." Christine nodded, wiping her eyes with her napkin. She said, "I do. And you deserve to be happy too, even if it's not with me." They talked for another hour, working through the practical details of ending their relationship, dividing up belongings, and deciding how to tell their friends. Christine was gracious and understanding in a way that made Robert feel even worse about hurting her, but also grateful that she was handling it with such dignity. As Christine was packing a bag to stay with her sister for a few days, she turned to Robert and said, "For what it's worth, Kyle is lucky to have someone love him the way you do." After she left, Robert sat alone in his apartment, feeling like his entire life had just been dismantled. He was terrified and relieved and heartbroken all at once. He had just ended a 3-year relationship and come out to himself and potentially destroyed his friendship with Kyle, all in the span of a few hours. He thought about calling Kyle, about telling him what had just happened, but he wasn't sure what he would say. Kyle had put himself out there, had been honest about his feelings, and Robert had essentially run away. He wasn't sure if Kyle would even want to hear from him now. Instead, Robert spent the weekend alone trying to process everything that had changed. He thought about his life, about who he really was underneath all the expectations and assumptions. For the first time in years, maybe ever, he felt like he was being honest with himself about what he wanted. Monday morning brought a text from Kyle that simply said, "I heard about you and Christine. Are you okay?" Robert stared at the message for a long time before responding. He typed and deleted several responses before finally settling on, "Can we talk?" Kyle's reply came immediately. "Of course. Your place or mine." They decided on Robert's apartment since Christine wouldn't be there. Kyle arrived that evening with takeout from Robert's favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine. He seemed nervous, which was unusual for him, and Robert realized that Kyle was probably as unsure about this conversation as he was. They ate in relative silence, making small talk about work and the weather, both avoiding the elephant in the room. It wasn't until they had finished eating and opened the wine that Robert finally found the courage to address what had happened. Robert said, "I broke up with Christine." Kyle nodded. He said, "I know, Gloria White told me." Robert took a sip of wine, trying to gather his thoughts. He said, "I told her I think I'm gay." Kyle's expression didn't change, but Robert saw something flicker in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or relief. Kyle said, "How do you feel about that?" Robert considered the question. He said, "Terrified, but also like I'm finally being honest with myself for the first time in my life." They sat in silence for a moment, and Robert could feel the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Finally, Robert said, "Kyle, what you told me last week about falling in love with me, did you mean it?" Kyle's eyes met his, and Robert saw complete sincerity there. Kyle said, "Every word." Robert felt something crack open in his chest, a rush of emotion so intense it was almost overwhelming. He said, "I think I'm falling in love with you too." The admission hung in the air between them, and Robert watched as Kyle's face transformed, surprise giving way to joy, giving way to something deeper and more complex. Kyle said, "Are you sure? I don't want you to say that because you think it's what I want to hear." Robert shook his head. He said, "I'm not sure about anything right now, except that when I'm with you, I feel more like myself than I ever have before. When you told me you were falling in love with me, it was the first time in my life that someone saying they loved me felt like coming home instead of like putting on a costume. Kyle was quiet for a moment, processing Robert's words. Then he said, "What does this mean? Where do we go from here?" Robert reached across the space between them and took Kyle's hand. Kyle's fingers were warm and slightly rough from his photography work, and the contact sent electricity shooting up Robert's arm. Robert said, "I don't know what it means for the long term. I'm still figuring out who I am, what I want, but I know I want to figure it out with you if you're willing to be patient with me while I work through all of this." Kyle squeezed his hand and said, "I've been patient this long. I can be patient a little longer." They talked for hours that night about Robert's relationship with Christine, about Kyle's own journey of understanding his sexuality, about their fears and hopes for whatever this thing between them might become. It was the most honest conversation Robert had ever had with another person. And by the time Kyle left, Robert felt like something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of himself. The next few weeks passed in a blur of discovery and adjustment. Robert and Kyle began spending more time together, but they took things slowly, both aware that Robert was still processing the end of his relationship with Christine and his own sexual identity. They went on what could only be described as dates, though neither of them used that word at first. Dinners at small restaurants where they could talk for hours without being interrupted. Walks through the city where they discovered hidden neighborhoods and shared stories about their childhoods. Long conversations in coffee shops that lasted until closing time. Kyle was patient and understanding, never pushing for more than Robert was ready to give. But Robert could feel the attraction simmering between them, growing stronger with each shared glance and accidental touch. When Kyle would brush his hand against Robert's while reaching for something, or when their knees would bump under a small table, Robert felt like his entire nervous system was on fire. Their first kiss happened 3 weeks after Robert's conversation with Christine. They were in Kyle's apartment, looking through some of Kyle's photography portfolios. Kyle was showing Robert a series he had done on urban loneliness, black and white images of people in crowded spaces who looked completely isolated. Robert was struck by the emotion Kyle had captured, the way he had made visible something that was usually hidden. Robert said, "These are incredible. You have such a gift for seeing people, really seeing them." Kyle looked up from the portfolio and something in his expression made Robert's breath catch. Kyle said, "I see you." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. Robert felt like Kyle was saying so much more than just those 3 words, like he was acknowledging everything that had passed between them, everything that was still to come. Robert leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and kissed Kyle softly. It was tentative at first, questioning, but when Kyle kissed him back, Robert felt like every cell in his body was lighting up. This was what he had been missing, this electricity, this sense of rightness that he had never felt with anyone else. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Kyle rested his forehead against Robert's and said, "Wow." Robert laughed, feeling giddy and nervous and more alive than he had ever felt. He said, "Yeah, wow." They spent the rest of the evening talking and kissing and marveling at how natural this felt, how right. When Robert finally went home that night, he felt like he was floating. For the first time in his life, he understood what people meant when they talked about being in love, about finding the person you were meant to be with. But along with the drawing came fear. Robert was still new to understanding his own sexuality, still learning what it meant to be gay in a world that hadn't always been accepting. He worried about how his family would react, about how his coworkers would respond, about whether he was strong enough to handle the challenges that might come. Kyle seemed to sense his anxiety without Robert having to voice it. One evening, as they were walking through Robert's neighborhood after dinner, Kyle said, "You know we don't have to tell anyone anything until you're ready, right? We can take this at whatever pace feels comfortable for you." Robert felt a rush of gratitude for Kyle's understanding, for the way Kyle seemed to anticipate his needs without making him feel weak or scared. Robert said, "What if I'm never ready? What if I'm too much of a coward to live openly?" Kyle stopped walking and turned to face him. He said, "Then we'll figure it out together. But Robert, you're not a coward. It took incredible courage to leave Christine. to be honest with yourself about what you want. You're braver than you think. Their relationship deepened over the following months, though they kept it mostly private while Robert adjusted to his new understanding of himself. They developed routines and inside jokes, learned each other's habits and preferences. Kyle introduced Robert to new music and books, expanding his horizons in ways that felt natural and exciting, while Robert helped Kyle with the business side of his photography, using his marketing skills to help Kyle build his client base and develop a more professional online presence. Robert found that he loved the domestic aspects of their relationship as much as the passionate ones. He loved making coffee for Kyle in the morning, watching Kyle's face as he slowly woke up and became aware of the day ahead. He loved the way Kyle would absently play with Robert's hair while they watched movies, loved the easy intimacy of sharing space and small daily rituals. He loved discovering Kyle's quirks and preferences, the way Kyle always ate the marshmallows out of cereal first, the way he hummed unconsciously when he was editing photos. But he also loved the way Kyle challenged him, pushed him to think about things differently, encouraged him to pursue interests he had abandoned. Kyle convinced Robert to start taking photographs again, and Robert discovered that his perspective on the world had changed dramatically since he had last picked up a camera. His new photos were more honest, more emotional, capturing moments of genuine connection and vulnerability that he had never been able to see before. The first time Robert introduced Kyle to his family was at his sister's wedding 6 months after they had gotten together. Robert had been dreading the event for weeks, unsure how to explain Kyle's presence, worried about his conservative relatives' reactions. But Kyle was charming and easygoing, winning over Robert's parents with his genuine interest in their stories and his obvious affection for Robert. Robert's mother pulled him aside during the reception and said, "I like him. He makes you happy in a way I've never seen before." The simple acceptance in her voice brought tears to Robert's eyes. He had been so afraid of disappointing his family, of being rejected for who he was. But his mother's easy acceptance of Kyle and their relationship felt like a gift he hadn't dared to hope for. Not everyone was as accepting. Robert lost a few friends who couldn't handle his coming out, and there were awkward moments at work when colleagues who had known Christine asked about their breakup. But for every person who reacted poorly, there were others who offered support and acceptance. And Robert began to understand that living authentically was worth the occasional discomfort. Kyle helped him navigate these challenges with patience and humor, never making Robert feel like his fears were unreasonable or his pace too slow. When Robert had a panic attack before his first Pride parade, Kyle held him until the anxiety passed and then offered to stay home instead of going. But Robert realized he wanted to go, wanted to be part of a community that celebrated love in all its forms. Walking through the crowds at Pride, holding Kyle's hand openly for the first time in public, Robert felt a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. This was his community, these were his people, and Kyle was his person. A year and a half after their first kiss, Robert and Kyle moved in together. They found a sunny apartment with good light for Kyle's photography and enough space for Robert to set up a small darkroom where he could develop his film photographs. The process of combining their lives, their belongings, their daily routines felt natural and right in a way that Robert's previous attempts at cohabitation never had. They hosted dinner parties for their friends, including Christine, who had become genuinely friendly with both of them after an initial period of awkwardness. She was dating someone new, a kind man who clearly adored her, and Robert was genuinely happy for her. Seeing Christine thriving in a relationship where she was truly wanted and appreciated confirmed for Robert that ending their relationship had been the right choice for both of them. Kyle's photography career was flourishing, and Robert had been promoted at work. They traveled together, exploring new cities and documenting their adventures with Kyle's Brady's camera and Robert's growing collection of film photographs. They talked about the future, about possibly getting married someday, about the life they wanted to build together. But even in their happiness, they faced challenges. Robert still struggled sometimes with internalized homophobia, with voices in his head that told him his love for Kyle was wrong or shameful. Kyle dealt with his own issues, anxiety about his career and occasional depression that made him withdraw from everyone, including Robert. They learned to navigate these difficulties together, to communicate openly about their struggles, to support each other through the hard times as well as the good ones. Robert discovered that real love wasn't just about the passionate moments or the easy times. It was about choosing each other every day, even when things were difficult. One particularly challenging period came when Kyle's father, who had never fully accepted Kyle's sexuality, became seriously ill. Kyle flew home to help care for him, and Robert could see the toll it took on Kyle to be in an environment where his relationship with Robert was treated as shameful or non-existent. Robert wanted to go with Kyle, to offer support, but Kyle's father had made it clear that Robert wasn't welcome. For 2 weeks, Robert waited at home while Kyle dealt with his family crisis alone. They talked every night, but Robert could hear the strain in Kyle's voice, could feel the distance that Kyle's family was trying to create between them. When Kyle finally came home, he was exhausted and emotionally drained, and it took weeks for him to fully recover from the experience. But the crisis also strengthened their relationship in some ways. Kyle's father's illness had reminded them both how precious their time together was, how important it was not to take their love for granted. They became more intentional about expressing their feelings, more committed to supporting each other through whatever challenges life might bring. Which brings us back to that Tuesday night in October, 3 years after they first met, when Kyle showed up at Robert's door, soaked from the rain with an expression that Robert had never seen before. They had been living together for 8 months by then, had settled into a comfortable rhythm of shared mornings and evening rituals. But something in Kyle's demeanor that night was different, urgent, like he was carrying something heavy that he couldn't quite set down. Kyle had been at a gallery opening, networking with potential clients and celebrating the work of a photographer he admired, when he ran into an ex-boyfriend who had never been supportive of Kyle's relationship with Robert. The encounter had been brief but unpleasant, with the ex making snide comments about Kyle's choice to settle down, about how he was wasting his youth on someone who would never fully understand what it meant to be gay, someone who was still figuring out his identity while Kyle had to play the role of patient teacher. The comments had gotten under Kyle's skin in a way that surprised him. He had thought he was past caring what other people thought about his relationship with Robert, but something about the encounter had shaken his confidence. By the time he made it home, he was spiraling into self-doubt, wondering if he was being fair to Robert, wondering if Robert would be happier with someone who hadn't had to help him figure out his sexuality, someone who could offer him a community and understanding that Kyle sometimes felt inadequate to provide. When Robert opened the door and saw Kyle standing there, dripping and miserable, his first instinct was concern. He pulled Kyle inside, helped him out of his wet jacket, and asked what was wrong. But Kyle couldn't seem to articulate what he was feeling, could only say that he was sorry, that he didn't mean to bother Robert with his problems, that he should probably just go to bed and deal with everything in the morning. And that's when Robert said those words that would echo in both their minds for days afterward. You never could. He meant it as reassurance, as a way of telling Kyle that his problems were never a burden, that Robert wanted to share in all aspects of Kyle's life, good and bad. But Kyle heard something else entirely. He heard dismissal, heard Robert saying that Kyle was incapable of affecting him, that Kyle's presence in Robert's life was so insignificant that it couldn't even register as a bother. The hurt that flashed across Kyle's face was immediate and devastating. Robert watched as Kyle's expression crumpled, as all the self-doubt and insecurity from his encounter with his ex came flooding to the surface. Kyle said, I see. I'm sorry for disturbing you. He turned to leave, but Robert caught his arm, finally understanding how his words had been misinterpreted. Robert said, Kyle, wait, that's not what I meant. Kyle stopped but didn't turn around. His voice was quiet when he said, then what did you mean? Robert felt panic rising in his chest. How could he explain that Kyle was so essential to his happiness that the idea of Kyle being a bother was impossible? How could he make Kyle understand that every moment they spent together felt like a gift? Robert said, I meant that you could never bother me because you're the most important person in my life. I meant that there's nothing you could ask of me, no problem you could bring to me that would ever feel like a burden. I meant that I love you so much that the idea of you apologizing for needing me breaks my heart. Kyle finally turned around, and Robert could see tears in his eyes. Kyle said, really? Robert crossed the space between them and cupped Kyle's face in his hands. He said, Really, Kyle, you're not a bother. You're not too much. You're not a burden. You're the person I choose every single day, and I will keep choosing you for as long as you'll let me. Kyle's face crumpled, and he leaned into Robert's touch. He said, I love you too. I'm sorry I misunderstood. I'm sorry I doubted us. Robert kissed him then, soft and sure, tasting salt from Kyle's tears and rain from the storm outside. When they broke apart, Robert rested his forehead against Kyle's and said, we're okay. We're always going to be okay. And in that moment, standing in their kitchen with Kyle's jacket still dripping on the floor and the sound of rain against the windows, Robert knew it was true. They had found each other against all odds, had built something beautiful and real and lasting. Whatever challenges came their way, they would face them together. And that was enough. That was everything.